Hello! Are you ready for some tips and tricks for the month of January? We've got a few things we're going to cover, and all of these will very much help you as you're making the projects for this month. The first thing that we are going to talk about is chain sewing. I'm going to demonstrate that with you right here. Also, as we get started, one tip for sewing with these small pieces is to make sure that you're not starting all the way at the edge here. Do you see how my needle is right at the edge, the end of this fabric? If I start sewing here, sometimes this needle will have the tendency to push the end of that fabric down into this bottom plate in my sewing machine and get things stuck. So what you want to do is, if you're worried about that or having that issue, you want to start about 1/4 inch in from the edge and also hold on to these strings. And what you can do is, once these strings get set, with a couple stitches, you can use this to help pull your piece towards the back of the sewing machine so that it won't get pushed down into the bottom. So I'm going to sew forward a couple stitches, and then I am going to reverse stitch, and this is going to take me back to that back edge. And then here's where I'm going to help the sewing machine pull that fabric through by holding and pulling a little bit with these threads. That will just keep this edge from kind of pushing down into the sewing machine. There we go. So now we're away from that. Now let's look at chain sewing. Basically what this means is I'm going to sew both of these pieces without stopping and cutting threads in between. So I'm going to get close to the edge here, and then I'm just going to put this piece here and keep going. And as this machine goes, you kind of feed this piece in there. And then the feed dogs on the bottom here, those things that go up and down, they reach up and they grab and pull this fabric, and then it just keeps going. Now again here, as you're at the edge here, if you are having issues with your sewing machine pushing the end of this fabric down into the bottom of the machine, you can hold on to this just like we did the thread at the beginning, and just give a little bit of a tug, a little bit of a help to your sewing machine. Now that we're at the end of our chain sewing, we can just snip this thread right in the middle, and then we have two pieces that we did without the extra time of cutting threads and restarting and all that stuff. The next important tidbit is having to do with ironing. Now when we are putting all these little tiny pieces of fabric together and wanting it to lay flat, we're going to have to iron all of these seams so that they lay flat. But we also don't want to see a weird looking seam through when we're done. So the trick to that is that we are going to press both sides of this seam over behind the darkest color of fabric that we have. So right here we can see that my blue is the lighter colored fabric and the red is darker. So what I'm going to do is place this right side down and press this seam towards the dark red color. And once that's done, we can see that it lays super flat and we can't see that seam. So again, we are going to lay this face down and see this one wants to go towards the blue, but we're going to make sure and make it go towards the red. There we go. Now this is also going to help when you want to put these two together. So maybe I want this to end up looking like this. What I can do is I'm going to put my right sides together, correct? And I'm going to want to make sure and line up these two seams. But since each seam goes opposite, see this one comes this direction and this one comes this direction, what I can do is I can put them together and slide them and they lock. Basically they go like this. They lock in together. And you can play around with this and notice it. If you don't feel a gap there, then it's perfect. And then when you sew it together and open it up, these lines will be exactly lined up. Honestly, I am not a big fan of hand sewing. I like anything that can be done on a sewing machine because I feel like it's easier and quicker. But since I don't like hand sewing so much, I've found some really good tips and tricks to make it easier, more fun, and less time consuming. So first, let's take a length of normal thread about this long. We don't want it too long, otherwise it'll get kind of tangled up. But what we're going to do is we are going to use this beeswax thread conditioner that you got in your monthly box. Now mine is a bit larger than yours, and the reason that I am using the large one is so that it's easier for you to see on the video. Do you see these little slits? This is where you're going to put your thread through. On the smaller beeswax that you got in your box, you will need to thread the thread through the side slit because the top of these slits are not open on the mini pieces. The other thing to note is if your beeswax is kind of dry and doesn't want to come off on your thread, you're going to want to make sure that it's in a warm home environment, or maybe near a stove while you're cooking, or near your heater, to try to get it to warm up a little bit so it'll get a little bit more waxy. So once you've done that, what we're going to do is we're just going to take this thread and put it through here like this and just pull it on through. Now what this does is it coats this thread with beeswax, and what beeswax does is it keeps the thread from getting all tangly and stuff once you're sewing. So once you put that through there, I just rub it through my fingers to make sure that all of that wax kind of didn't clump anywhere. Now here is a huge tip. We're going to take both ends of this, both cut ends, and we're going to hold them together. And then we're going to go ahead and cut them off so that they're even. Now I'm going to put both of these ends through the eye of my needle. Now this is going to come down here towards the looped edge here, and I'm going to actually put all 4 strands now of this together. Now, why do we do this? Well, if we have 4 strands here, every time we make one stitch, we are making a stitch with the strength of 4 stitches. So this means that you get to do 1/4 less stitching. And that's always nice, right? Okay, so now, how do we start and tie a knot without having an awful little tail hanging out there? So what we're going to do is, I'm going to show you how I'm going to put my button on here. I want my button to go right here in the center where everything connects. So I'm going to start about 3 inches this direction, and I'm going to put my needle in here and try to come out where those come together. Now notice, I'm not coming out the back side. My needle is in between the layers. So this is just going to hide the tail. So now I'm going to come out here. And once I pull and pull, watch this tail, it's going to go inside and it'll hide. Okay, so once it's hidden, I want to put my finger on here to hold it, because now we're going to tie a knot. What we're going to do is just take a tiny, tiny, tiny stitch right next to where our thread came out of the fabric. And now we can see we've got a loop, right? Well, I'm going to come up through this loop once, and then make it a little smaller, and then I'm gonna come up through that loop one more time in the same exact direction. And then I'm just gonna tighten it down. So now I've got a little knot and no tail hanging off. So now I'm just going to put one stitch, actually, is all I'm gonna do through here, because remember, one stitch now is 4. And then I'm just going to take a tiny bit of this fabric here and then pull this tight. Okay, now this is tight. How am I going to tie a knot at the end without the tail showing? Well, we're gonna do it similarly to what we did before. Take a tiny, tiny stitch right next to where your thread comes out. Just like we did before. Making sure that you still pull on the side connected to the button to make sure it's still tight. Once we get this loop, we're going to come up through the bottom, pull a little bit more, and then go up through it the same exact direction. Now we're going to pull this tight. Does this seem familiar? Once it's tight, we're going to do the opposite of what we did when we started. We're going to go down into the fabric right next to where our knot was. Make sure you're not going through the back. And go out about 2 or 3 inches. Okay? So pull this through. Now, in order to cut this so that it's shorter and will suck back in here, we're going to hold on to this and just scooch it a little bit. See how it just puckered this up? Now that it's puckered up, we're going to cut this guy right here. And then watch, when we let go, it all sucks inside. I hope that all of these tips and tricks were very helpful to you, and I'm excited to see the projects that you make with them.